The first time Lila and her family drove through Oak Ridge Estates, it felt like a scene straight out of a magazine. Manicured lawns stretched perfectly under the warm sunlight. Identical beige houses lined up like soldiers, and every mailbox was neatly decorated in uniform harmony. Lila's husband, Mark, was grinning ear to ear as he imagined Sunday barbecues on their new patio, and their teenage son, Alex, was already planning the perfect spot for his basketball hoop. For Lila, it felt like stepping into a world she'd always dreamed of, safe, orderly, and full of neighbors who probably waved at each other every morning. Buying their house had been the culmination of years of scrimping, late nights, and endless paperwork. They had envisioned a sanctuary, a place to raise their family, host birthday parties, and perhaps even retire in a couple of decades. Moving day was a whirlwind of boxes, laughter, and exhausted sighs. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, they were sitting on their new porch sipping cold lemonade, basking in the feeling of accomplishment. Everything seemed perfect. However, perfection has a price, and in Oak Ridge Estates, it came in the form of the Homeowners Association, or HOA. At first, the HOA seemed like a minor inconvenience, a set of rules that promised to maintain the community's aesthetic and property values. It was, according to their brochure, a small monthly fee for big peace of mind. Lila didn't mind. After all, who wouldn't want tidy lawns? Freshly painted fences and streets free of random clutter? The trouble started innocently enough. Lila had a small American flag she'd inherited from her grandfather, a proud veteran. She wanted to place it in the front yard for Memorial Day, a gesture of respect and remembrance, simple, harmless, and patriotic. But when she received the letter from the HOA a week later, her heart sank. They cited a violation. Flags could only be displayed on national holidays, and even then, only if they were mounted on a specific type of pole purchased through the HOA. Lila stared at the letter in disbelief. A fine? For a flag? What followed was a mix of disbelief, frustration, and confusion. She tried explaining to the HOA board, but their responses were curt and bureaucratic. Rules are rules, one of them typed in an email. You must comply or face penalties. The fine was small, $50, but the principle felt enormous. How could something meant to honor a soldier become a legalistic nightmare? And why did the rules feel so arbitrary, so focused on control rather than community? It wasn't just about the money, it was about autonomy, pride, and the creeping realization that perfection in Oak Ridge Estates came with invisible chains. Lila had thought she was buying a dream home. Instead, she had purchased a set of rules that someone else controlled, rules that could turn her own yard into a battlefield. Lila spent the next few days in a haze of disbelief. Every time she looked at the flag still gently fluttering in the breeze, she felt a pang of irritation mixed with guilt. It was just a flag, just a symbol of respect, and yet, here it was, the epicenter of an escalating conflict. She tried to reason with herself. Maybe it was just a minor misunderstanding. Surely the HOA would see her side if she explained her grandfather's story, if she shared the significance of the flag. Her first attempt was polite and concise. She emailed the HOA board, detailing her grandfather's military service and her desire to honor him. She attached old photos, medals, and even a scanned copy of his service record. Within hours, a reply arrived. It was formal, almost cold. While we appreciate your sentiment, Oak Ridge Estates' flag policy must be adhered to without exception. The fine remains in effect. That night, Lila and Mark sat at the kitchen table, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. It's $50. We can pay it and move on, he said, trying to keep the peace. But Lila shook her head. It's not about the money, she insisted. It's about principle. They can't just control everything we do in our own yard. Determined to fight, Lila attended the next HOA meeting. The board members, stiff and immaculately dressed, greeted her with polite but distant smiles. She stood and spoke, her voice shaking slightly, explaining her position, her family's pride, and her grandfather's service. She expected understanding, perhaps even sympathy. Instead, the board chairman adjusted his glasses and recited the exact Text of the HOA rules, word for word. Our regulations are clear, he said. Flags must comply with approved guidelines. Non-compliance results in fines. The meeting ended with little resolution, leaving Lila feeling frustrated and powerless. On the drive home, she wondered how her dream neighborhood had turned into a cage of rules. The more she thought about it, the more absurd it felt. A symbol of national pride, an act of personal honor punished by bureaucracy. Back at home, Alex, her teenage son, tried to lighten the mood. Mom, maybe we can just get the approved pole and make it fancy. Problem solved? But Lila shook her head again. It wasn't about fancy poles. It was about autonomy, about standing up for what mattered, about refusing to let tiny fines dictate her family's choices. That evening, Lila posted on a local community forum, sharing her story. Responses flooded in, some supportive, some dismissive. HOAs are strict for a reason, one neighbor commented. Rules are rules, said another. But many others shared similar experiences. Fines for garden gnomes, complaints about wind chimes, penalties for paint colors. Lila realized she was not alone. This wasn't just a personal battle, it was a systemic issue. As the sun set over Oak Ridge Estates, the flag still stood, stubborn and proud. And so did Lila, knowing that the next chapter of this suburban saga would demand patience, persistence, and perhaps a little courage she hadn't expected to need. The following week brought an unexpected turn. Lila returned home from work to find another letter slipped under the front door. This one was more threatening. Stamped in bold red letters, second notice, non-compliance. With HOA regulations, her hands shook slightly as she read it. The fine had doubled and a deadline loomed. It was no longer just a $50 inconvenience, it had become a clear warning. Mark tried to remain calm, suggesting they simply comply and avoid further trouble. We don't want to escalate this, he said cautiously. But Lila's resolve had hardened. She wasn't going to let bureaucracy bully them into submission. If she removed the flag, it would feel like surrender, like giving in to an invisible authority that valued uniformity over personal expression. The couple decided to consult a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. The consultation revealed a complicated world of bylaws, local ordinances, and case precedents. Many HOAs operate in gray areas, the attorney explained. They often push boundaries to assert control, and residents rarely push back because it's inconvenient or intimidating. But legally, you might have standing if the rules are being enforced inconsistently or unfairly. Armed with this information, Lila felt a mix of empowerment and anxiety. Fighting the HOA wasn't just about her flag anymore, it was about her rights as a homeowner and the principle of fair treatment. Yet, the thought of attending another tense HOA meeting or entering a legal dispute was daunting. Lila spent late nights reading case studies online, discovering stories of families fined for pumpkins, shutters, and even holiday lights. The more she read, the clearer it became. Oak Ridge Estates was part of a larger trend where HOAs exercised rigid control under the guise of community standards. Determined to push forward, Lila created a small strategy. She documented every interaction with the HOA, photographed the flag in the yard, and kept records of her emails. Every detail could matter if the fight escalated further. Alex, noticing his mother's stress, tried to help by creating a simple chart of the timeline of events. Even Mark began to see the broader implications. It was no longer a simple act of patriotism. It had become a test of resilience, patience, and civic awareness. Tensions bubbled when neighbors began whispering about the situation. Some were supportive, nodding or waving in solidarity when they passed by. Others were critical, warning that challenging the HOA might make life uncomfortable. Lila realized that standing up to the system came at a social cost, too. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, the flag remained planted, fluttering defiantly against the backdrop of Oak Ridge's meticulously trimmed hedges. That night, as the wind rustled through the trees, Lila sat on her porch reflecting. The flag had become more than fabric and stitching. It was a symbol of resistance, of refusing to let small authorities dictate one's sense of right. She didn't know what the next move would be, but one thing was clear. Her suburban dream had turned into a battleground, and she wasn't backing down. The tension in Oak Ridge Estates had reached a boiling point. Word of Lila's dispute with the HOA spread quietly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors admired her courage, while others avoided her, fearing the same type of conflict. Lila and Mark had long conversations about whether the battle was worth it, but each time they looked at the flag in their yard, the answer became clearer. This fight wasn't just about rules. It was about dignity, autonomy, and refusing to be silenced. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and Lila decided she would attend once again. She came prepared, armed with photos, legal references, and even a few supportive notes from neighbors who believed in her cause. The board greeted her politely, but with an unmistakable air of formality, as if they were debating an abstract problem rather than a family's pride and personal expression. When it was her turn to speak, Lila's voice was steady. She explained the significance of the flag, the grandfather who had served his country, and the principle of personal freedoms within one's own home. She highlighted inconsistencies in how the rules were enforced and emphasized the small, almost symbolic nature of her display. The board listened, nodding occasionally, but their responses remained rigid, almost rehearsed. But something changed in the room. One by one, neighbors began speaking up. A mother cited how her child's basketball hoop had been flagged for a minor infraction. An elderly couple recounted fines for seasonal decorations. The room, once filled with polite compliance, now buzzed with frustration and solidarity. Lila realized that her stand had inspired others. This wasn't just her battle anymore. It was a community conversation about fairness, respect, and shared spaces. After what felt like hours, the board finally recessed. When they reconvened, they presented a compromise. Lila could keep her flag as long as it adhered to certain minor technical standards, which she could easily accommodate. The fine would be waived. Relief washed over her, but it was tinged with exhaustion. The victory was small in the grand scheme, yet enormous in meaning. She hadn't just defended a flag. She had defended a principle that mattered deeply. That evening, Lila, Mark, and Alex sat on the porch, watching the flag flutter proudly in the breeze. They reflected on the ordeal, laughing softly at the absurdity of being fined for patriotism. The neighborhood felt different somehow, more human, more connected. They knew other battles would come, minor or major, but this one had set a precedent, not just for themselves, but for others who might face similar struggles. In the end, Oak Ridge Estates remained orderly and picturesque, but Lila's experience served as a reminder. Even in the most perfect suburban dream, rules and authority have limits, and courage can bloom in the smallest acts. A single flag, stubbornly flying, had become a beacon, not just of respect for the past, but of standing up for one's values, no matter how bureaucratic the opposition. Enjoying this story of HOA battles and suburban drama? Hit that subscribe button to catch more real-life neighborhood tales and homeowner insights. Also, give this a like if you found it eye-opening, and drop a comment below. What would you do if your own yard rules were challenged?